I'm going to go through the process of working through Photoshop to do a simple frame-based animation. And I'm not going to do probably a complete animation in this video because it does take a little while, but I'm going to do the first few frames just to give you an exposure to how that workflow presents itself, as well as how to get those frames out of Photoshop so that we can bring them into After Effects. So the first thing to note is from the last video, we opened up our timeline, which is there. We also kind of forecasted that we'd be working with layers. So that's kind of how Photoshop is going to work, is each of these layers, we don't need the background, so I can go delete that. But each of these layers is considered a frame in our animation. So I suppose if we wanted to keep that background to have some sort of a white backdrop there, we certainly could. So maybe I'll just, maybe I should replace that real quick. But what we have in front of us is the opportunity to create frame by frame a block animation, and that's what's going to come up in our exercise later on. So to begin with, I'm going to just create a simple block graphic, and I'm using a pen tablet, so I'm going to have, my drawings are going to be a little bit more organically placed, and so you can follow suit if you have access to a tablet. If you don't, you can make these graphics using the mouse, using the brush tool or the shape tool. It's really kind of up to you on how you want to create these, but to get kind of that organic look, I'm going to go ahead and use my tablet. So if I start by just drawing out you know, a simple block shape and leave that on layer 2. The process of doing frame by frame animation in Photoshop really is driven by those layers. So I'm going to create another layer, layer 3, and on layer 3 I'm going to start my block just kind of squashing a little bit. Now I'm going to leave layer 2 present, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw just a slight squish for my block. I'm going to leave the floor exactly where it is, and then I'm going to go up to layer 3, or sorry, layer 4 rather, create layer 4. And then I'm going to squash this block even further. This is that anticipation step that we talked about. And I'm leaving all these frames up as a guide. It's not a requirement. I could certainly turn them off so that way I could focus just on the you know, the page, the layer, the drawing in front of me. But I kind of like seeing how those previous layers forecast what's coming next. So I will add one more layer. This is layer 5. And now we've really got this block squashed up. And so this is that anticipation, the squash before the leap. So if I'm making this animation, it's going to be just a simple block jump. I am going to, these are the first 5 drawings. Then here's the fun part. So the next drawings could be copies of the previous ones. So if we're expecting this block to squash out and then squash back in the exact same way, I don't necessarily have to create layer 6 from scratch, so I can get rid of that. What I can do is create a duplicate of layer 4, and then I'm going to drag that up in the order. The order of these is going to make sense later. Then I'm going to duplicate layer 3, and then that's going to come up to the top of my stack. And then I'm going to duplicate layer 2, which should be my first frame if I have done this properly, and bring that up to the top of my stack. And so now I'm just going to deselect all these, or rather hide all of them, and just step through this to make sure that it's working properly. So here's frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, oops, frame 4, or rather, yeah, frame 4, layer 5, then 4, 5, and 6. So looks pretty good. Let's test it out. So we've got these loose frames drawn. Now we're actually going to activate that timeline we spoke about earlier. So timeline is down in the bottom left corner, and we can make new frames in our timeline by hitting the plus button. So when I hit that plus button, it creates a new, think of it like as a new page on a flip book, but then we get to choose what's present on each of these frames. So I'm going to go over to my layers, and for frame 1, I want that layer 2 active. And then in frame 2, selecting it there, I don't want layer 2 active. In fact, I want layer 3 active. So now when I page between these two, you can see that change takes place. I'll do that again for frame 3, and I will turn off layer 3 and turn on layer 4. And then frame 4, Forgive me that the layers and frames aren't quite lining up, but you get the idea. Turn off layer 4, turn on layer 5. And so then I'm just kind of paging through these to make sure that that still looks good. And frame 5 gets layer 4 copy. And I usually would clean up the layer names, but you'll see when we export that it's not really going to matter. So right now they're a little sloppy, but that's okay for now. Frame 6 gets layer 3 copy. Frame 7 gets layer 2 copy. So now that we've created all of these frames based off all of these layers, you'll notice that we're really just using that process of hiding and making visible those drawings we did before. Now over here in our timeline, we can hit the play button and we can see that that animation is playing accordingly. So that's pretty nice. There are other features of the timeline in Photoshop that we could get into, including a full kind of video animator type approach, timeline approach. But there's a few things like there's delays down here that you could set. So if you're using Photoshop to really do animation and you didn't have access to After Effects, perhaps these delays would make sense for you to use. But for now, we're just using this as kind of a preview tool. So I'm not going to mess with any of those delays. So that looks pretty good. Then let's say if we wanted to do more frames, as I add new frames, so if I did this timeline check just for now, if I wanted to add more frames, it can get a little bit kind of quirky. So if I add another layer, for example, layer 6, and in layer 6, I decide to draw, that same block. But if I started to draw the hint of like these little like surprise blips, you may notice as you go through your other frames, those blips are present. Because you made a new layer, it shows up in all those frames of your timeline. So this can be a little bit irritating. You have to go through and on frame 1 remove those blips, and then it should cascade down ideally until you get back to frame 7, and that's when you want those blips to be present once again, right? So now if we go through, we notice that it works as expected. So I might make a few more frames. So here's take off layer 6, and now we have layer 7. I draw that same, well, let's leave that one on so I know what I'm drawing. Trace that block, and then those blips go out a little bit more. Let's imagine they're kind of like shooting off from the block. The block's happy or whatever. Then, of course, remembering that we probably have to go through and get those blips turned off in frame 1, and then that should cascade down to the others. And then turning frame 7 back on. So now we should have, oops, sorry, my mistake. Make sure that we're making new frames down here. So we have frame 6. We need this to be, I think, layer 6. So now we have that. We have that block. There we go. So we need that one. Then we go to full. And then we go to that one. And then we create a new frame. So make sure you're creating frames as well. That was kind of my mistake. I'm getting those confused there. So now we have a full kind of squash and then blink, blink, blink. So I'm going to hit stop. So you can kind of go through this flow of every 5 to 10 frames, kind of get your timeline configured to test out your animation loosely before we would bring it into something like After Effects. So in the forecasted exercise, we'll end up doing a block animation to try and convey some sort of an emotion. And we're going to use one of the approaches to make that animation is this straight ahead action. And so that's this frame by frame by frame approach. And this is a way you can get that done in Photoshop.